Search her. Now. The command cut through the soft jazz like a blade wrapped in silk, sharp enough to silence a room full of million-dollar conversations. And for a moment, even the clinking of crystal glasses seemed to hesitate, suspended midair under the amber glow of imported chandeliers. All eyes turned not to the man who spoke, but to the woman standing still beside table 12, her hands steady around a silver tray, her posture unshaken, her face unreadable, as if the weight of the accusation had landed. Somewhere far away from her skin, Naomi Brooks did not flinch, did not protest, did not even look at the security guard stepping toward her with rehearsed authority, because instead of reacting, she lifted her gaze slowly, past the polished marble floors, past the velvet ropes and designer suits, straight toward the small black dome camera embedded in the ceiling above, like she was acknowledging something no one else in that room could see. Around her, whispers spread quickly, low and judgmental, the kind that carried centuries inside a single breath. Phrases like, "It's always the quiet ones," and "I knew something felt off," slipping between guests who never once looked her in the eye when she refilled their water, yet now felt entitled to decide her guilt in seconds. The manager arrived next, his smile tight, professional, but already leaning toward the side of power, because in places like this, where a single dinner bill could cover someone's rent for a year, truth was rarely louder than wealth. "We just need to check your bag," he said, voice smooth, controlled, but firm enough to make it clear this wasn't a request. And still, Naomi said nothing, her silence not empty but deliberate, as if she were waiting for something, or someone, or maybe just the right moment for the truth to catch up to the lie. What no one at that table knew, what none of the guests scrolling their phones or lifting their glasses realized, was that 2 floors above them, behind a wall of tinted glass and quiet machines, a man was already watching everything unfold in real time. Ethan Caldwell, CEO, founder, the kind of man whose decisions moved markets before breakfast, stood alone in the control room, one hand resting lightly against the edge of a console, eyes locked on the live feed displaying Naomi's still figure at the center of the chaos. He hadn't planned for it to go this far, not this quickly, but he also hadn't looked away, because what he was seeing now wasn't just an accusation. It was a pattern, one he had been tracking for weeks, subtle discrepancies, missing items, complaints that never quite aligned, all pointing towards something buried beneath. Polished service and 5-star reviews. Tonight was supposed to confirm a suspicion, a quiet test hidden inside a routine evening. But as the tension below tightened like a drawn wire, Ethan realized something else was being revealed, something less about theft and more about people, about who speaks, who gets believed, and who is expected to stay silent. On the screen, Naomi remained motionless as the guard reached for her bag. And for the first time, Ethan noticed the smallest shift, a breath. Slow and controlled, not fear, not panic, but patience. And something about that unsettled him more than any report ever had, because power, he knew, could control outcomes, but it could not always predict truth. And tonight, truth was standing in the middle of his restaurant, wearing a name tag no one had bothered to read, waiting to be seen. The zipper stopped halfway, caught between 2 fingers that suddenly were not as confident as they had been seconds before, and in that small pause, something shifted in the room, subtle but undeniable, like a current changing direction beneath still water. Naomi did not move, did not lower her gaze from the camera above, because she had already understood something the others had not, that this moment was no longer about a missing watch. It was about who would be believed when no one wanted to listen. The guard cleared his throat, adjusting his stance as if trying to regain control of a situation that was quietly slipping beyond procedure, while the manager forced a polite smile toward the surrounding guests, attempting to package the tension into something digestible, something temporary. But the whispers had already grown louder, sharper, feeding on assumption rather than fact. A woman at the table folded her arms and leaned back, her voice low but deliberate, saying they should hurry this up, that people like her always drag things out. And the words landed not just on Naomi but echoed across the room, reinforcing a narrative that had been written long before this night began. Above them, Ethan Caldwell leaned closer to the screen, his jaw tightening slightly, not from anger but from recognition, because the pattern he had Bin tracking was unfolding in real time, not through data or reports, but through behavior, through instinct, through the quiet decisions people made when they thought no one important was watching. He tapped once on the console, pulling up another angle, another feed, watching as the timeline rewound just a few minutes earlier, to the moment before the accusation, before the tension, when the dining room had still been filled with laughter and effortless confidence. There, in a corner frame, the man who had first spoken leaned casually in his chair, adjusting his cuff, his expression relaxed, unaware of the camera positioned behind him, and in that unnoticed second, something small but critical happened, his hand brushing against his coat, slipping the watch not into Naomi's reach, but into the inner pocket of his own jacket, a careless motion, almost invisible, but undeniable once seen. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in surprise, but in confirmation, because the truth had never been hidden. It had simply been ignored, buried beneath assumptions that felt easier to accept than reality. Back on the floor, the guard finally pulled the zipper open, revealing neatly folded items, nothing out of place, nothing that matched the accusation, and yet no one spoke, no one apologized, because absence of evidence did not immediately erase belief. It only created an uncomfortable silence where certainty used to be. Naomi lowered her eyes from the camera for the first time, not in defeat, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she knew the moment was approaching, the exact second when perception would be forced to confront truth. And in the control room, Ethan made his decision, not rushed, not emotional, but precise, because power, when used correctly, was not about reacting first. It was about stepping in at the exact moment when silence could no longer protect a lie. He reached for the door, the soft hum of the monitors continuing behind him, and as he stepped into the hallway, the distance between observation and action disappeared, leaving only one thing certain, that the next voice the room would hear would not ask, would not suggest, but would reveal. That will not be necessary. The voice did not rise, yet it carried across the room with the kind of authority that did not ask for attention. It commanded it, and one by one, heads turned not out of curiosity, but recognition. The guard froze first, his hand still hovering above the open bag. Then the manager straightened, his practiced smile faltering for the briefest second before he stepped aside instinctively. Because when Ethan Caldwell walked onto the floor, the atmosphere itself seemed to adjust, like the room had been waiting for him without realizing it. He did not hurry, did not show urgency, because urgency would have suggested doubt, and Ethan did not deal in doubt. He dealt in certainty. His gaze moved once across the scene, not lingering on Naomi, not yet, but on the man seated at the table, the one who had spoken first, the one whose confidence now flickered beneath the surface, subtle but visible to anyone who understood power the way Ethan did. "Close the bag," Ethan said calmly, not to Naomi, but to the guard, and the zipper slid back into place with a quiet finality that felt louder than the accusation had moments before. A murmur spread again, but this time it was different, less certain, less unified, as if the room itself was beginning to question what it had so quickly accepted. Ethan stepped closer, his presence now fully within the circle of tension, and only then did he look at Naomi, really look at her, not as staff, not as background, but as a person standing at the center of a moment that had been forced upon her, and in her stillness, he saw not fear, but control, the kind that did not need to prove itself. "You said something was missing," he continued, turning his attention back to the man, his tone even, almost conversational, but carrying an edge that made interruption impossible. The man shifted slightly, adjusting his posture as if trying to reclaim the confidence he had worn so easily before, insisting that the watch had been there, that it had been on the table, that it did not simply disappear, and for a second, the old certainty tried to return to his voice, but it no longer filled the room the same way. Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he had heard the claim and already moved past it, because the truth did not need repetition, it needed revelation. "You are right," he said, and the words landed unexpectedly, causing a ripple of confusion, a brief moment where the room leaned forward again, wondering if the narrative would return to its original path. But Ethan did not pause long enough for that to settle, because he reached into his jacket and removed a small device, sleek, almost invisible, the kind that controlled more than it revealed. With a single press, the lights dimmed slightly, and along the far wall, a screen came to life, pulling every eye away from Naomi and towards something far less comfortable. The footage began without introduction, showing the same table, the same moment from minutes earlier, but now from an angle no one in the room had considered. And as the seconds played out, the truth unfolded without commentary, without accusation, just action, clear and undeniable. The man's hand moved, casual, unremarkable, slipping the watch into his own inner pocket in a motion so natural it had escaped notice the first time. But now, magnified and repeated, it became impossible to ignore. Silence followed, not the polite kind, not the awkward kind, but the heavy, undeniable kind that forces reflection whether it is wanted or not. Ethan did not look at the screen, he watched the room instead, watching belief collapse, watching certainty dissolve, watching power shift. In real time, and only after the footage ended did he speak again, his voice unchanged, calm, measured, but now carrying something else entirely, not authority, but truth. And in that moment, the narrative that had been written for Naomi no longer belonged to the people who had created it. It belonged to reality itself. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to defend, and in a room where confidence had filled every corner just minutes ago, silence now took its place like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. The man at the center of it all sat frozen, his posture no longer relaxed, his fingers subtly tightening around the edge of the table, as if he could hold on to something that had already slipped away. And for the first time that night, his eyes did not meet anyone else's, because there was nowhere to look that did not reflect the truth back at him. The guests who had whispered so freely before now avoided each other's gaze, their earlier certainty dissolving into discomfort, because it is one thing to assume and another to witness, and once seen, the truth does not quietly disappear. Ethan Caldwell let the silence stretch, not out of cruelty, but because he understood something most people in that room did not, that real consequences begin in moments like this, not with punishment, but with realization. He stepped slightly to the side, clearing the line of sight between Naomi and the man who had accused her, not forcing confrontation, but allowing it to exist, because sometimes the most powerful act is simply removing the illusion that protected someone from being seen. "Would you like to check your jacket?" Ethan said finally, his tone unchanged, calm, almost neutral, but the words carried a weight that left no room for deflection, and slowly, reluctantly, the man's hand moved, slipping into the inner pocket that had seemed so insignificant before, and when he pulled it out, the watch caught the light in a way that felt almost deliberate, its polished surface reflecting not wealth, but consequence. A soft ripple moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to mark the exact moment when perception fully shifted, when the narrative that had once pointed at Naomi now turned back toward its origin. The manager stepped forward, instinctively, beginning to speak, to apologize, to contain the situation, but Ethan raised his hand slightly, stopping him without a word, because this was not a moment to be managed. It was a moment to be understood. Naomi remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, not triumphant, not vindictive, but composed in a way that made the entire room feel smaller around her. Because dignity does not need volume to be heard. Ethan turned toward her then, and for a brief second, something passed between them that no one else could fully interpret. Not gratitude, not pity, but recognition, the kind that acknowledges presence where it had previously been ignored. "You are cleared," the manager said quickly, his voice now softer, careful, but the words felt insufficient, too small for what had just unfolded, because clearing someone of a lie does not erase the weight of being accused in the first place. Ethan's gaze shifted again, this time toward the staff positioned along the edges of the room, the ones who had watched quietly, who had learned long ago when to speak, and when to stay invisible. And in that glance, something changed, subtle but real, because power had just been forced to acknowledge what it usually overlooked. He took a step back, not retreating, but resetting the space, allowing the room to breathe again. But the air had changed, heavier now with awareness, with the understanding that what had happened was not an isolated mistake. but a reflection of something deeper, something that could no longer be ignored. And in the center of it all, Naomi stood not as someone who had been defended, but as someone who had endured, and that difference, quiet as it was, carried more weight than any apology that could follow. The room did not return to normal, not immediately, because moments like this do not simply reset. They linger, settling into the walls, into the memory of everyone present, reshaping what had once felt routine into something far more permanent. Conversations did not resume, not in the same tone, not with the same ease, because every word now carried the weight of what had just been revealed. And for many in that room, the discomfort was not about the mistake, but about how easily they had accepted it. The man who had made the accusation finally stood, his movements slower now, less certain, the confidence that had once defined him replaced by something quieter, something closer to realization. And though his lips parted as if to speak, no words came, because apology, in its truest form, requires more than sound. It requires understanding, and that was only just beginning. Ethan Caldwell watched him for a moment, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a level of detachment that came from seeing patterns repeat too many times to take them personally. And then he shifted his attention, because the focus of this moment had never truly been about the man who was wrong. It was about the person who had been made to carry that wrong. Naomi Brooks adjusted her grip on the tray slightly, a small, almost invisible movement, as if her body was reminding itself that the night was not over, that there were still tables to clear, still duties expected of her, because in places like this, even after everything, the role does not pause, it continues. That was when Ethan spoke again, not loudly, not for the entire room, but clearly enough that it reached every corner. "Take the rest of the night off," he said, his tone direct, not offering, not suggesting, but deciding. And for a second, Naomi did not respond, not out of hesitation, but because she was not used to being given space in a moment like this. She was used to being expected to move past it, to continue as if nothing had happened. The manager quickly nodded, stepping forward as if to reinforce the instruction. But there was something in Naomi's expression that stopped him from speaking, because she was not looking at him. She was looking at Ethan, measuring something unspoken, something deeper than authority. "I can finish my shift," she said calmly, her voice steady, carrying no defiance, only clarity, and the words shifted the balance once more. Because this was no longer about permission, it was about choice. Ethan held her gaze for a brief moment, and in that silence, there was no tension, no need to assert control, only recognition, because strength does not always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like the decision to continue on your own terms. He nodded once, not overriding her, not insisting, but acknowledging, and that small gesture carried more respect than any public statement could have. Around them, the staff watched quietly, absorbing every detail, every shift in tone, because what had just happened was not just an isolated event. It was a recalibration of something they had long understood without ever saying out loud. The manager stepped back, the guests remained seated, and slowly, cautiously, the room began to move again, but not in the same way, not with the same assumptions, because something had changed, something subtle but lasting. And at the center of it all, Naomi did what she had always done. She moved forward, not because the night demanded it, but because she chose to, and that choice, quiet as it was, carried a power that no accusation could take away. The rhythm of the room returned slowly, but it was no longer the same rhythm, not the effortless flow of status and performance that had defined it earlier, but something quieter, more cautious, as if every movement now carried a second thought behind it. Naomi moved between tables with the same precision she had always carried, her steps measured, her posture straight, but there was a shift in how the room responded to her, subtle yet undeniable. Conversations paused when she approached, eyes followed her not with dismissal but with awareness, because once someone has been seen clearly, it becomes impossible to return them to invisibility. Across the floor, the man who had made the accusation remained seated longer than expected, his untouched glass catching the dim light as he stared into it, not drinking, not speaking, as if trying to reconcile the version of the night he had believed in with the one that had actually unfolded. And eventually, without announcement, he stood and Left, his exit quiet, unremarkable, but heavy with something unspoken, because not every consequence is loud. Some simply follow you out the door. Ethan Caldwell remained near the edge of the room, not drawing attention, not reclaiming the spotlight, but observing, the way he always had, except now his focus was no longer on patterns of business or efficiency. It was on something less measurable, something human, the way the staff interacted, the way the guests adjusted their tone, the way a single moment had exposed layers that reports and numbers could never fully capture. He noticed the manager speaking more carefully, choosing words with intention, noticed the staff standing a little straighter, not out of fear, but out of something closer to validation. Because being seen once has a way of changing how you carry yourself moving forward. Naomi reached the service station, setting down her tray for a brief second, her hands resting lightly against the polished surface as she took a quiet breath, not a release, not exhaustion, but a recalibration, the kind that happens when something shifts inside you, even if you do not fully name it yet. A fellow server approached, hesitant at first, then offering a small nod, not exaggerated, not performative, just enough to acknowledge what had happened without turning it into something else. And Naomi returned the nod just as simply, because dignity does not need to be discussed to be understood. From across the room, Ethan watched that exchange, and something about it held his attention more than the reveal itself, because the truth had already been proven. But this was the aftermath, the part no one plans for, the part that determines whether a moment becomes a lesson or just another story forgotten by morning. He stepped closer to the service station, not interrupting, not announcing himself, but present enough that Naomi noticed him without surprise, as if she had been aware of his presence long before he arrived. For a second, neither of them spoke, because not every moment requires words. And then Ethan said quietly, "You handled that better than most people would." His tone sincere, not flattering, not exaggerated. And Naomi considered the statement for a brief moment before responding. "I handled it the only way I could." Her voice even, her gaze steady, and in that exchange, simple as it was, something deeper settled into place. Not a resolution, not a conclusion, but an understanding that what had happened was not just about being proven right or wrong. It was about being seen, truly seen, in a space that had never intended to offer that. And as the night continued, moving forward in measured steps, the room carried that awareness with it, quiet but lasting, like a shift in gravity that no one could quite ignore. Why did you not defend yourself? The question came not from across the room, not from a guest, but from much closer, quiet enough that it almost blended into the low hum of returning conversation, yet precise enough that Naomi heard it clearly as she adjusted a row of polished glasses at the service station. She did not turn immediately, because she already knew who had asked, and more importantly, she understood that the question was not about curiosity, it was about perspective. Ethan Caldwell stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed, his presence no longer commanding the room but focused entirely on the space between them, as if this conversation mattered more than anything else still unfolding around them. Naomi finished aligning the last glass before she responded, her movements deliberate, not delaying, but choosing her moment the same way she had chosen silence earlier. "Because it would not have mattered," she said finally, her voice calm. Not defensive, not bitter, just certain, and the answer hung there for a second, simple but heavy, forcing Ethan to consider not just the words, but the reality behind them. He studied her for a moment, not questioning her statement, but measuring it against everything he had just witnessed, because in his world, speaking up was often the first move, the expected move, but what he had seen tonight challenged that assumption in a way no report or meeting ever had. It mattered when the truth came out. He replied, not as a correction, but as an observation, and Naomi met his gaze then, steady, unflinching, as if she had already thought through that argument long before he voiced it. The truth mattered, she said, not who said it. And there was no accusation in her tone, no attempt to shift responsibility, just a clear distinction that landed deeper than any direct critique could have. Ethan exhaled quietly, the kind of breath that signals understanding rather than resistance, because in that moment, he realized something he had overlooked, not intentionally, but consistently, that access to truth is not the same for everyone, and neither is the weight of being heard. Around them, the staff continued their work, the guests resumed their conversations, but the energy remained altered, less performative, more aware. As if the room itself had absorbed the lesson without needing it to be repeated, Naomi picked up her tray again, the familiar weight grounding her in routine. But there was a subtle difference now, not in how she carried it, but in how the space responded to her presence, because respect, once introduced, does not easily disappear. Ethan stepped slightly to the side, giving her room to pass, not as a gesture of authority, but of acknowledgement, and as she moved past him, he spoke once more, not loudly, not for recognition, but for clarity. I saw what happened before anyone else did, and the statement might have sounded like reassurance in another context, but here, it carried something else, an admission of timing, of distance, of the gap between seeing and acting. Naomi paused for just a fraction of a second, not stopping, not turning fully, but enough to let the words settle, and then she said, "You saw it when it was safe to see," her voice still even, still composed, but now carrying a layer that was impossible to ignore, not confrontational, not harsh, just true. Ethan did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to correct, only something to absorb. And as she continued across the floor, re-entering the rhythm of the room on her own terms, he remained where he was, not as the man who had revealed the truth, but as someone who had just learned that seeing is not the same as understanding, and that difference, quiet as it was, would stay with him long after the night ended. By the time the last course was served, the room had settled into something quieter, not calm, not entirely comfortable, but aware in a way it had not been before, as if every conversation now carried a second layer beneath it, something unspoken but understood. Naomi moved through the final stretch of her shift with the same steady rhythm, clearing plates, refilling glasses, responding when spoken to, and stepping back when she was not. But the difference was in the space she occupied, no longer overlooked, no longer dismissed, but acknowledged in small, subtle ways that did not require words. A guest who had earlier avoided eye contact now offered a quiet thank you. Another shifted his chair slightly to give her room instead of expecting her to adjust. And these gestures, simple as they were, marked a shift that could not be undone. Near the entrance, the manager stood straighter than usual, his tone more measured with both staff and guests, because he understood, perhaps for the first time, that leadership was not just about maintaining order, it was about recognizing when that order had been built on something flawed. Ethan Caldwell remained until the very end, not out of obligation, but because leaving early would have felt like closing a chapter that was not yet finished. And as the final guests gathered their coats and stepped out into the night, the restaurant exhaled, the lights dimming slightly, the music fading into something softer, signaling that the performance was over, but the impact remained. Naomi returned her tray to the service station, wiping it down with practiced efficiency, her movements familiar, grounded, as if returning to routine was not a retreat, but a choice, a way to reclaim control over a night that had tried to define her differently. One by one, the staff began to clock out, exchanging brief nods, quiet goodnights. But there was a shared understanding between them now, something that did not need to be discussed to be felt, because they had all witnessed the same moment, and it had changed how they saw the space they worked in. Ethan approached once more, this time without the weight of urgency, without the tension of intervention, just a man stepping into a conversation that had been unfolding all night. And for a moment, he did not speak, allowing the silence to exist without pressure, without expectation. Naomi finished folding the cloth in her hand before looking up, meeting his gaze with the same steadiness she had carried from the beginning. And in that quiet exchange, there was no hierarchy, no distance, just two people standing in the aftermath of something that had shifted both of them in different ways. "Tomorrow will be different," Ethan said, not as a promise meant to impress, but as a statement he intended to carry through. And Naomi considered the words briefly, not dismissing them, but not accepting them blindly either, because she understood that change is not declared, it is demonstrated. "We will see," she replied, her voice calm, grounded, leaving space for truth to prove itself over time rather than in a single moment. Ethan nodded, not pushing further, not asking for validation, because he had already learned that night that respect is not something you claim, it is something you earn, and as he turned to leave, the distance between them was no longer defined by status, but by perspective, by what each of them had seen, understood, and carried forward. Naomi watched the door close behind him for a brief second before returning to her work, the final tasks of the night unfolding with quiet purpose. And as the last light above the dining floor dimmed, the space held on to something new, something subtle but lasting, not a grand transformation, not a dramatic ending, but a shift in awareness that would echo long after the tables were cleared and the doors were locked. Because sometimes the most powerful changes are the ones that do not announce themselves, they simply remain. The doors closed with a soft final click, sealing the night behind them. And for a moment, the restaurant stood still, stripped of its performance, its polished voices, its carefully curated image, leaving only what remained when no one was watching. Naomi Brooks stepped out into the cool night air, the city humming in the distance, headlights tracing quiet lines across the street as if nothing significant had happened, as if the world had not shifted in the smallest but most important way. She paused just outside the entrance, not out of hesitation, but out of habit, taking in a breath that belonged only to her, free from expectation, free from observation, and for the first time that night, her shoulders lowered slightly, not in relief, but in release, the kind that comes when you no longer have to hold a moment together for others to understand it. Inside, lights continued to dim one by one, the reflection of the dining room fading into the glass behind her, and with it, the version of the night that had tried to define her. Across the street, a car slowed briefly, its driver glancing toward the restaurant, unaware of the story that had just unfolded within, unaware that something as quiet as dignity had just reshaped a space built on power. Naomi began to walk, her steps steady, unhurried, not carrying the weight of what had happened, but not dismissing it either, because moments like that do not disappear. They settle, they become part of how you see the world, part of how you move through it. Back inside, Ethan Caldwell remained for a few minutes longer, standing alone in the now empty room, his reflection faint against the darkened windows, and for a man who had spent years building systems, controlling outcomes, predicting results, this night had left him with something different, something less defined but far more lasting. He had not just witnessed an error, he had witnessed a pattern, not in numbers, but in people, in assumptions made too quickly, in voices dismissed too easily, and in the quiet strength it took for someone like Naomi to stand without breaking under it. He turned off the final light. Himself, a small act, but deliberate, because leaving it to someone else would have meant missing the point entirely. And as he stepped outside, the night felt different, not because the world had changed, but because his understanding of it had. He saw Naomi already halfway down the block, her figure blending into the rhythm of the city, not standing out, not asking to be noticed, just moving forward the way she always had. And for a brief second, he considered calling out, saying something more, offering something tangible, but he did not, because he understood now that not every moment needs to be followed, not every story needs to be extended, some simply need to be respected. Naomi did not look back, not because she did not care, but because she did not need to, because what had happened was not about being saved, it was about being seen, and once that happens, there is nothing left to prove. The streetlight above flickered softly, casting a steady glow over her path as she continued forward, and somewhere behind her, a man who had always believed power defined a room had learned something far more difficult. That power without awareness is empty, and that night, in a space built on control, it was not power that changed everything. It was truth, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to ignore.